Hey, what's up filmers? So in today's video, let's talk about Micro Four Thirds and whether or not it makes sense to buy one of these cameras here in 2023. So if this is your first time on my channel, you should probably know that I have a pretty long history of shooting Micro Four Thirds. I bought the GH3 when it first came out and I liked it so much that I ended up buying the GH1 and then hacking it to use as a B cam. And then I discovered the G6, used that for a while, the original Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera. And then later on, I ended up buying the GH4 and then the G85 and then the GX85 and then finally landing on the EM1 Mark II. So I've been using Micro Four Thirds for a really long time and I've always really liked this system. But when it comes to cameras and sensors, I'm completely agnostic. I really don't care what camera brand or sensor size I'm using. I just want it to have a really good price to performance ratio and produce a nice looking image. Okay. So when it comes to choosing cameras to buy, I always think of two things: price and performance. On one side, you have high performing cameras with great quality, great specifications. And then on the other side, you have lower priced cameras that usually have lower quality video and pretty bad specs. But I always try to sit right in the middle. And I really think that's where Micro Four Thirds shines. Because companies like Panasonic and Blackmagic have packed a lot of insane features into Micro Four Thirds cameras where they give you really, really good performance, but still stay at a really budget-friendly price point. So some of the pros of Micro Four Thirds I definitely think is the size. The camera bodies are nice and compact, and the lenses that you can get for Micro Four Thirds cameras are really nice and compact. I would definitely say more so than even some of the really small full frame lenses. Like the lens that I'm using right now is a Panasonic 14mm f2.5. Such a small and compact lens, and it's great for vlogging. So the size is one of the biggest pros I think for Micro Four Thirds. Also the image stabilization, just because the sensor is so much smaller, it can kind of float around inside of the Micro Four Thirds bodies, and the image stabilization on cameras like the Panasonic GH5 and even my EM1 Mark II is second to none. So that's a really big thing that you have to consider. Some other negligible things are like the color. It's typically pretty decent on Micro Four Thirds cameras, definitely out of the GH5 and the EM1 Mark II, and audio is always pretty good. There's a lot of pros still for Micro Four Thirds, but with all of the new cameras coming out that have bigger sensors and have fixed a lot of the issues that they had in the past, there are a lot of cameras with bigger sensors that do pose some competition for Micro Four Thirds cameras. So those are the pros of Micro Four Thirds, but obviously there are some cons as well. For instance, getting a shallow depth of field look is a little bit more difficult on a Micro Four Thirds camera just because the sensor is smaller. It's not impossible, but it is a little more difficult. And that also leads to the low light performance not being as good, save for the GH5S or the Blackmagic Pocket 4K. Every other Micro Four Thirds camera does struggle a bit in low light performance, but I think one of the biggest things that has held the Micro Four Thirds system back is basically every camera has abysmal autofocus, except obviously for the camera that I use, the Olympus EM1 Mark II, the Mark III, and the new OM1. But basically, unless you want to own a fringe camera like I do and get one of the Olympuses, if you get any other camera by Panasonic or Blackmagic, the autofocus will be horrible. And again, that's one of the things that has caused so many people to switch camera systems, especially if you're a content creator or YouTuber, is they switch to a system that has better autofocus because you're usually a one-man band and you can't be pulling focus when you're not at your camera. There have been other YouTubers who have kind of posed the question, is Micro Four Thirds dead? And obviously it's not. OM Systems is still making cameras. Panasonic said that they're not going to abandon their Micro Four Thirds line. I'm sure that Blackmagic will probably come out with a new pocket camera that will probably have a Micro Four Thirds sensor. And there's even a new camera that just got released. It's called like the Bosma Pro G1 or something like that. It's an 8K camera. It has a Micro Four Thirds mount. So Micro Four Thirds cameras and sensors are still being used, but the question that I kind of wanted to pose in this video is, are they still worth investing in if you're a budget filmmaker? Now, I recently put out a poll on my YouTube community page on what budget meant to you, because I feel like that word is a little bit subjective. A $2,000 camera to one person could be a budget-friendly camera where it could be totally out of reach for somebody else. So the price range that got the most votes and what most people think of when they think of budget camera was $500 or less, which I understand. That is a very budget-friendly price point. But what came in second place was the $1,000 price range, which I think is a lot more reasonable. So let's talk about some of the Micro Four Thirds cameras that you can get in the $1,000 range, as well as larger sensor cameras that are around the same price. And keep in mind, every camera that I'm going to be talking about is going to be used prices, because I feel like if you're a budget filmmaker, you should always buy used. And with all these new cameras coming out, it makes the previous camera go down in price, which is really nice. So there are a lot of cameras in the Micro Four Thirds world within that $1,000 used price range that are still definitely worth considering, like the Blackmagic Pocket 4K, which is amazing, Panasonic G5, Panasonic G9, and if you need one with autofocus, this EM1 Mark II can easily be had for around $500 to $600. But here's where it gets a little tricky. There are really good cameras with larger sensors in that $1,000 used price range that are really worth considering as well. The first one I can think of is like the Sony a6400. That's a great APS-C size sensor, and it's an oversampled 6K image, so you're getting a really sharp 4K video out of that. It's got amazing autofocus, and it's a great introduction to the Sony ecosystem, which a lot of video shooters have switched to. The next one is the Fujifilm X-T3. That gives a great 10-bit image, has a Super 35 sensor, and it gives really good colors. You're losing image stabilization, just like with the Sony a6400, but it's still a really good image under that $1,000 price tag. And lastly, one that I think really shakes things up is, ever since the new Panasonic S5 II came out, the original S5, which I used to own, has gone down in price significantly. I've seen it on eBay body only for $1,100. And one thing that a lot of people don't really consider a lot of the times when they're thinking about these different cameras with different sensor sizes is you can buy something like the original S5 with a full frame sensor and then invest in old vintage lenses, and you don't have to worry about speed boosting, and you're using the entirety of the lens. When I had the original S5, I used the Canon FD 24mm and 50mm, which cost me like $100 for both of them on eBay. And you didn't have to worry about speed boosting. A 24 is a 24 on full frame, so you're using the entirety of the lens, and you can put together a really inexpensive lens set to use on a full frame camera, and it's a lot easier, especially to get wide shots. So that's another thing to consider. Like, should you try to find a original S5 for $1,100, or spend $800 on a GH5 and still have to spend a lot more money on lenses, speed boosters, and all that kind of stuff? Back in 2015, when the Sony a7S II was released, there was a huge following for that camera, and everyone that was using it really loved it. But they had some things that they really wanted in the successor, which is better color, good autofocus, and image stabilization. And then 5 years later, Sony released the a7S III, which addressed all of those issues that every Sony shooter was having. Sure, they released the a7 III and a few other cameras in between then, but the true successor to the a7S II was the a7S III, and it fixed almost all the problems that the a7S II shooters had. Now, if you look at that in contrast with Panasonic and their GH5, which came out in 2017, the GH5 is still one of the best cameras that Panasonic has ever released, and it packed so much of a punch for that price point. 10-bit, 4K 60, great body, great weather sealing, battery life, everything was great about that camera except for the autofocus. That was the one thing that every GH5 owner wanted, was better autofocus in that camera. And then 5 years later, in 2022, they released the GH6, which had crazy specs and it was packed full of amazing features. But the one thing that they did not address was the autofocus. And that's kind of how you can see how some Micro Four Thirds shooters are kind of frustrated, because especially when you've invested in the system and you really like the form factor and all the lenses that you have, but the company that you've been supporting all these years has just been stubborn and doesn't want to move with the times and add better autofocus into their camera. I got some anamorphic lenses that I get to play with for the next couple of weeks. Video on these coming soon, but what's the conclusion that I've come to in all this? Am I gonna get rid of all my Micro Four Thirds gear and switch to a system with a larger sensor? Probably not. I can definitely see myself using Micro Four Thirds cameras for the foreseeable future. But what I am saying is, When it comes to cameras that fit right in the middle of that price to performance scale, I can definitely say that for the budget filmmakers, Micro Four Thirds aren't necessarily the only options when it comes to finding a good camera that fits in that price to performance ratio. There are cameras from Sony, Fujifilm, and even Panasonic with larger sensors that are around the same price as their Micro Four Thirds competitors. So although Micro Four Thirds isn't going anywhere, I definitely don't think that they're the only option for us budget-friendly filmmakers who want a lot of performance at a not so high price. But I'd love to know your thoughts on this in the comment section below, as well as your thoughts on this style of a video. It's not a tutorial or a gear review, but I really like doing these. And if you'd like to see some more of my videos, you can click on either side of my face. And remember, you must go out.